Hello, classmates. Today, we will study national welfare arguments against free trade, focusing on two main arguments: the terms of trade argument for a tariff and the domestic market failure argument against free trade. First, the terms of trade argument for a tariff. This argument for deviating from free trade comes directly out of cost-benefit analysis for a large country that is able to affect the prices of the foreign exporters. A tariff lowers the price of the imports and thus generates a terms of trade benefit. This benefit must be set against the cost of a tariff, which arises because the tariff distorts production and consumption incentives. It is possible that, in some cases, the terms of trade benefits of a tariff outweigh its costs. So there is a terms of trade argument for a tariff. For a sufficiently small tariff, the terms of trade benefits could outweigh the costs. Thus, a large country welfare is higher than with free trade. Look at figure 1. As the tariff rate is increased, however, the costs eventually begin to grow more rapidly than the benefits, and the curve relating national welfare to the tariff rate tends down. A tariff rate that completely prohibited trade, TP in figure 1, leaves the country worse off than with free trade. Further increases in the tariff rate beyond TP have no effect, so the curve flattens out. At point 1 on the curve in figure 1, corresponding the tariff rate T0, national welfare is maximized, which is known as the optimum tariff. The optimum tariff rate is always positive, but less than the prohibitive rate TP that would eliminate all imports. What policy would the terms of trade argue dictate for export sectors? Since an export subsidy of a large nation worsens the terms of trade, and therefore unambiguously reduces national welfare, the optimal policy in export sectors must be a negative subsidy, that is, a tax on exports that raises the price of exports to foreigners. Like the optimum tariff, the optimum export tax is always positive, but less than the prohibitive tax that would eliminate exports completely. But the terms of trade argument against free trade has some important limitations. Most small countries have very little ability to affect the world prices of either their imports or exports, and thus the terms of trade argument is of little importance to them. Besides, it would bring retaliation from other large countries. In practice, the terms of trade argument is more often emphasized by economists as a theoretical proposition than actually used by government as a justification for trade policy. Second, the domestic market failure argument against free trade. Many economists concede the concepts of producer and consumer surplus, especially producer surplus, do not properly measure costs and benefits. Why might producer surplus not properly measure the benefits of producing a good? This includes the possibility that the labor used in a sector would otherwise be unemployed or underemployed. The existence of defects in the capital or labor markets that prevent resources from being transferred as rapidly as they should be to sectors that yield high returns, and the possibility of technological spillovers for the industries that are new or particularly innovative. This can all be classified under the general heading of domestic market failures. Suppose, for example, that the production of some good yields experience that will improve the technology of the economy as a whole, but that the firms in the sector cannot appropriate this benefit and therefore do not take it into account in deciding how much to produce. Then there is a marginal social benefit to additional production that is not captured by the producer surplus measure. This marginal social benefit can serve as a justification for tariffs or other trade policies. Figure 2 illustrates the domestic market failure argument against free trade. Figure 2a shows the conventional cost-benefit analysis of a tariff for a small country. Figure 2b shows the marginal benefit from production that is not taken account of by the producer surplus measure. Figure 2a shows the tariff will result in production distortion indicated by A and the consumption distortion indicated by B. If we consider only consumer and the producer surplus, we will find that the cost of the tariff exceeds its benefits. Figure 2b shows this calculation overlooks an additional benefit that may make the tariff preferable to free trade. The increase in production yields a social benefit indicated by C. We can show that if the tariff is small enough, the area C must always exceed the area A plus B, and there is some welfare maximizing tariff that yields a level of social welfare higher than that of free trade. The domestic market failure argument against free trade is a particular case of a more general concept known in economics as a theory of the second best. This theory states that a hands-off policy is desirable in any one market only if all other markets are working properly. If they are not, a government intervention that appears to distort incentives in one market may actually increase welfare, offsetting the consequences of market failure elsewhere. For example, if the labor market is malfunctioning and fails to deliver full employment, a policy of subsidizing labor-intensive industries, which would be undesirable in a full employment economy, may turn out to be a good idea. When they were first proposed, market failure arguments for protection seemed to undermine much of the case for free trade. After all, who would want to argue that the real economies we live in are free from market failures. In poor relations, in particular, market imperfections seem to be substantial. For example, unemployment and the massive differences between rural and urban wage rates are present in many less developed countries. Also, markets workers better in advanced countries. There exist market failures, for example, the inability of innovative firms to reap the full rewards of their innovations. How can we defend free trade, given the likelihood that there were interventions which could raise national welfare? There are two lines of defense for free trade. The first argues that domestic market failure should be corrected by domestic policies aimed directly at the problem's sources. The second argues that the economists cannot diagnose market failure well enough to prescribe policy. The point that domestic market failure calls for domestic policy changes, not international trade policies, can be made by cost-benefit analysis modified to account for any unmeasured marginal social benefits. Figure 2 showed that a tariff might raise welfare despite the production and the consumption distortions it causes, because it leads to additional production that yields social benefits. If the same production increase were achieved via a production subsidy rather than a tariff, however, the price to consumers would not increase and the consumption loss would be avoided. In other words, by targeting directly the particular activity we want to encourage, a production subsidy would avoid some of the side costs associated with the tariff. This example illustrates a general principle when dealing with market failures. It is always preferable to deal with market failures as directly as possible, because indirect policy responses lead to unintended distortion of incentive elsewhere in the economy. Thus, trade policies justified by domestic market failure are never the most efficient response. They are always second best rather than first best policy. This insight has important implications for trade policy makers. Any proposed trade policy should always be compared with a purely domestic policy aimed at correcting the same problem. If the domestic policy appears too costly or has undesirable side effects, the trade policy is almost surely even less desirable. The second defense of free trade is that because market failures are hard to identify precisely, it is difficult to be sure what the appropriate policy response should be. For example, suppose there is urban unemployment in a less developed country. What is the appropriate policy? One hypothesis says that a tariff to protect urban industrial sectors will draw the unemployed into productive worker and thus generate social benefits that would more than compensate for the tariff costs. However, another hypothesis says that this policy will encourage such migration to urban areas, that unemployment will in fact increase, it is difficult to say which of these hypotheses is right. While economic theory says much about the working of markets that function properly, it provides much less guidance on those that don't. There are many ways in which markets can malfunction, and the choice of the second best policy depends on the details of market failure. The difficulty of asserting the correct second best trade policy reinforces the political argument for free trade. If trade policy experts are highly uncertain about how policy should deviate from free trade and disagree among themselves, it is all too easy for trade policy to ignore national welfare altogether and become dominated by special interest politics. If the market failures are not too bad to start with, a commitment to free trade might in the end be better policy than trade protection. That's all for this lecture. Thanks for joining. See you next time.